everybody, and thank you so much for coming out to Happy McGill's first ever happiness conference. My name is Naomi, and this is Sierra.
Hey guys.
Today we have two guest speakers, which will be Joe Schwartz and Christopher Barrington-Leigh.
So first we're going to bring up Ronald and Chris. They're going to tell you a little bit more about our club.
Thanks.
Welcome to the event. We're at the founders of this club. So our objective is to advocate happy living on the campus because we find that our society focuses too much on earning money and economic growth. But something really inherent in us is the pursuit of happiness. That's why we want to start it from the level of university for our students to expose to the study of well-being and try to think how we can maximize our societal happiness.
Given that university represents a very significant time in our life, it's very formative for us. We should kind of build the foundation for us to be happier individuals later on in life. And that's why we kind of wanted to get things started here at the university level and see where we can go with it.
So we're glad that today we have two very, very good speakers who share with us about the happiness on health and the happiness and relative to happiness economics.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Well, after that last talk, I think I've learned what field to go into if you want to be able to give a riveting talk filled with humor, and it's not economics. It's not physics either. So I'm not going to try again, but if I did, it would be something. Maybe it would be to figure out the theory of what makes people well. So this talk is going to look a little bit more academic in the sense that there's going to be numbers and plots and so on. But I'm going to give a not very well directed, sort of random survey of some ideas and issues in how economists are thinking about and contributing to our understanding of what makes for a good life for people, which is often in more general or late terms referred to as what makes people happy. So let me start by thinking about the big picture, which is, to put it in order to put happiness economics into the context of the way things have been done in economics for a good fraction of a century, 2/3 of a century or so at least, but longer depending on how you count. What should we be thinking about when we're thinking about a metric, an objective by which society, meaning policymakers or society in general, should be making decisions? In other words, what are we chasing after? If we're, as a society, if we want a good life, what would that be? And if you don't have such an objective even in principle, it can be difficult to make policy decisions. So the standard method that economists use, they call revealed preferences. And that essentially means that you watch what people do, you watch behaviors, and you take those behaviors very seriously, especially when you can see that people are making costly decisions. And if somebody makes a costly decision, you assume that they are showing you something about what's good for them. And if you have situations where you can observe many decisions and you can somehow assess their cost, then you can actually infer a lot about what is in people's preferences. In economics terms, what's in the utility function. And if we simply then infer that people are making decisions which improve their own welfare or their own well-being, then in fact if we are able to maximize people's choices somehow, in other words, increase their choices without decreasing any options, then we've probably increased their welfare. So this rather seductive logic is how economists sort of go from, as I say, from behaviors to talking about social welfare. Now I'm going to mention three maybe obvious problems with this in a moment, but let me first fill out a menu of 3 other ways that you might go about. If there's a gain on that, I'd like to turn it down somewhere. three other ways that you might go about deciding on a metric, on a measure of social welfare. Another is stated beliefs and values. So rather than using this maybe a crude assumption that that's nice too. I just meant that I had feedback on the audio, so if there's an audio gain as well, volume. Thank you. No, that's better. So we could also, rather than just assuming that everything that we see that people do is good for them, roughly speaking, we could say, well, we actually might have values that are somehow not reflected in our actions. And so we could go around and ask people, well, what things are important for a good life? What things would you like to see valued in our decisions? And so if you do that, people say, well, I think health is good, and how well can people hear me without this? In the back, am I all right? Am I messing up the TV if I don't use the audio? So if you could do anything about the volume, that would be great. So you might come up with answers like health, like education, and material income. In fact, factors that we tend to pursue in our what we call development policy, and indeed in our social policy in all countries. And you could even throw together an index like the UN's Human Development Index. There are problems with this one too. Here's another. Rather than asking for people's opinion about which aspects of life, which aspects of experience are good for a happy life, you could not let them make that calculation or not seek their opinion, their expertise on that. You could simply say, how does life feel? Okay, so this is in fact what I'm going to focus on mostly. It's where most of the literature in this field is. And it appeals to both people's cognitive sense of whatever are their values and their objectives and whether they're meeting those two experience, and also their gut. Okay, so in other words, the evidence they will use for answering a question about how good life feels will include their recent mood, their emotion. So I'll come back to this in a moment. But we're really after an all-encompassing response about how good life feels. If you collect information like that, it's now up to, again, an analysis of data, up to maybe a statistician to say, well, we have people answering this question, and those people have all kinds of different circumstances in life. Maybe we can figure out by looking at the variation in circumstances and the outcomes in terms of how happy people are, about which things seem to promote happiness. So this is so far these are all very different approaches in my view. The last one is more similar. It's saying rather than appealing to sort of a cognitive answer about how good is life overall, maybe we should really just be focused on what psychologists call affect. So are people happy? What fraction of the time are you spending in a happy state? And maybe if we built a society in which everyone was happy 100% of the time, that would be the best case. So that's a bit crude. I would say the best way to characterize what proponents of this suggest would be to say, what fraction of the time do people have more happy emotions than negative emotions? Okay, so you can imagine me asking you, so far today, how much have you laughed and smiled? Or have you laughed or smiled much? Have you felt frustration or anger today? In the extreme case, I could hook you up with what we might call a headometer to measure your feelings continuously and simply average over time. And we could hook everybody up that way and get instant feedback on our policy changes. Maybe that's the way to go. Let me tell you some problems maybe with each of these. I've got a slide probably only for the real preference ones, but some of these are shared with others. So this is the case where we just watch what people do, watch their behavior, and assume that people are improving their life by making the choices that they make. What's wrong with that? Well, it's possible that that might be a good description of an individual, but that when I make a choice, it might be good for me, but it might actually be somewhat bad for others, or it might even be equally bad for others as it is good for me. Okay, if you take economics, you call this an externality. Secondly, people might not be making the right decision. If you've taken class in economics, you probably haven't heard that one. Because we don't tend to worry about that. To think that people are making bad decisions, not just randomly some of the time, but on average, in other words, that there could be systematic biases in people's decisions, that they're systematically not making the best choice for their happiness, for their welfare, for their well-being. That economists don't like, have traditionally, I should say, not liked that, that possibility, because it opens the door to Big Brother. It opens the door to paternalistic policy, essentially, right? If I believe that people don't know what's good for them, then where does that lead us? And really, how would you ever be accountable to evidence to know what really is good for people if you have a theory that they're wrong? And of course, the third problem with revealed preferences is that I said you need to be observing choices which are costly in order to do this job properly of analyzing what decisions people have made. Well, we don't see all the choices people have made, and in fact, we don't get to make choices about many of the circumstances in our life, right? We get to make actually a fairly narrow set of choices, and even a narrower set of those are, say, visible on the market and therefore easily observed by economists and quantified by economists. Now, going back to these, let me just point out problems with a couple of the others as well. The stated beliefs and values sounds interesting, and I mean, the UK, I would say, has just gone through a big process where they did this. They canvassed their population for ideas of what should be on the measure of well-being. And this measure of well-being is something the government under Cameron is very serious about taking into account for policy. In other words, he believes policy should be made in order to increase such a measure of well-being. Now, the problem is if you have a whole bunch of things that people say are important, how do you combine those into a measure that you can make decisions on? And the HDI, as an example, the UN Human Development Index just equally weights the various parameters that are of interest there. So that hasn't caught on in terms of policy because it's not what I would call empirically accountable. Those weights are now arbitrary. You could argue about what the correct weights are, but we're sure that the correct weight is not to equally weight everything. Okay? The subjective evaluation of life has the advantage then that you don't have to make up those weights. You ask one question and you let the data, by looking at what people's circumstances are, tell you which things, the degree to which things are important and the degree to which they're important. And that would be true for affective states as well. The big problem there is that if you ask people how happy they are at the moment, and then you ask them instead to reflect on a past experience, their answer is not going to be very highly correlated with the average experience they had during that time. In fact, if you ask them whether they want to repeat an experience or how they reflect on it, they will give you an answer which depends more on the peak emotion and the final emotion. So there are, I'm referring to studies both for good things and bad things. So these data come from studies of pain during colonoscopies. And during a colonoscopy, which if you've had one is apparently very painful, they were asking patients continuously throughout the procedure, how much pain you're in now? How much pain are you in now? And now how much pain you're in? And they plotted this over time, and then they did a rather dangerous sounding experimental intervention. They told the doctors, then in a follow-up, then they said, they asked how bad was that experience overall. And what they found was that the peak pain mattered, but the end of the procedure mattered a lot. And as well as people's reflection, future decisions, do you think that was a useful procedure? Would you be willing to do that again? Related to the same things. And so they told the doctors to prolong the painful procedure, in other words, increase the total amount of pain the patients were suffering, by faking the end. So when they're basically done what they needed to do, hang out for a while, take out the probe slowly, okay, so that the ending feeling for this procedure was less bad. And it turned out that if you do that, people have a better reflection on the procedure, they're more willing to undergo the medical treatment again. Similarly, if you ask people, if you look at a holiday that somebody goes on, let's say you're going off and spending time on a beach somewhere, and you hook people up and ask them how happy they are every hour of every day, you don't find something that tells you whether they reflect well on the holiday or if they're going to take one in the same place next time. What matters is how things ended, and sort of what the peak experiences were. Okay, so I haven't told you any downsides of the subjective evaluation of life category, just the other three, and but we'll come to discuss those. Let's be a little bit more specific about how we might quantify life quality. And here it is. I want you to close your eyes for a moment and answer to yourself this question. Taking all things into account, how satisfied are you with your life these days on a scale of 0 to 10? So 0 here stands for very dissatisfied. 10 stands for very satisfied. Okay, probably you have all come up with a number already, which is one of the most remarkable things about this question. So this has now been asked to to millions of people around the world, in many countries, and in some of them quite a lot. And it's on the surface asking a very odd thing. It's asking for somebody to take something which is clearly very subjective, has emotional content, is an extremely difficult calculation because it takes into account, as I mentioned before, whatever they think is important in terms of their aspirations, in terms of their values, in terms of their experiences, add it up somehow and come up with a numerical response. Okay, so we have something which is very subjective, but it's quantitative. We're putting all the burden on the individual to quantify this measurement for us. So notice this is not asking how are you feeling at the moment. It's called this is why we call it a cognitive evaluation. And we're also not asking for people's opinion about what is good for a good life. In fact, which was number 2 in the list I gave earlier. In fact, in principle, I don't care what people answering this question think is good for them, because I'm allowing for the fact that they may be wrong. Okay? I believe that by asking how life feels, I'm actually getting at something which is more valuable for the way I use the data than to say what is important. So there are now decades of studies trying to understand how people come up with this answer and whether they're doing what we think they'd like to do. So, by the way, I asked you all to go through this. I should say that most of the, I said it's been asked to millions of people. These are, of course, anonymous surveys, right? This is telling the answer to someone who you're never going to meet. In that case, people are willing to answer it. But if you ask this of a friend or family member, it's actually an incredibly personal question. And I now have taken up the habit of doing that, and it's a very nice way to open up the door to catching up with somebody and to find out what are the big drivers of their life conditions. Okay, so how do people actually do this calculation? Imagine that just before I'd asked you that question, I had commented, "Have you been outside today? Wow, the weather really sucks, doesn't it?" What do you think would have happened to your answers? Do you think you would have been biased to give a higher or lower answer? Lower? Turns out when this experiment was done, so people came in on different days, and it was done over a long enough baseline that weather changed. And in some cases, the interviewer casually mentioned the weather, and some they didn't. It turns out when the weather was mentioned, the correlation between the actual weather and people's answers went down. Which means that if I say, wow, the weather sucks, and then I give you this difficult calculation to do, you're actually, rather than being primed to say, weather's bad, I must be unhappy, you are apparently primed to say, weather is bad, right, I'm not going to let that affect my answer because it's about my life. And so you actually manage to take out that particular piece of your affective experience in making the calculation. Okay, so this is support for the idea that we use our recent emotional experiences to help answer the question, but we're really trying to do it in a way that assesses our long-term well-being. So if you ask that of people, I'm happy to turn Skype off, by the way, if you like. It's not bothering me. They seem to go away after a short amount of time. If you ask this question to people all around the world, and thanks to an amazing venture of the Gallup Corporation, it's now being done every year, you find a pattern something like the following.
Sorry for that.
Not at all. So this is a similar question. It's a cognitive evaluation of life, and you can see the green places are relatively happy. And without going into details, I can tell you that the top here countries are in Northern Europe, Scandinavia. You can see Canada does quite well. I'll come back to the fact at the end that if Quebec were its own country, it would actually be up there above most of the Scandinavian countries, something like a number 2 in the world. Okay, so 30 years ago, people started using the available life satisfaction and happiness data to do what the economist would naturally do when they came across the concept of what? You've been asking people how good life is? That's fantastic. That's our concept of, surely, related to our concept of welfare, of utility. I wonder what happens when economies, people, societies undergo the kind of changes that we care about as economists. And so Dick Easterlin first started looking at this, and he found some funny things. He found that if you look within a society, so he didn't have as many countries as I just showed you, but he had several in a fairly wide variety in terms of wealth. He looked at within a country, the richer people were happier. However, over time, countries, as they became richer, were not getting happier. And he posed this as a major dilemma for economics and said, what is going on? There are two probable classes of explanation, both of which are somewhat major problems for the way we think about economic growth and welfare. And so there's two possibilities. I've shown you now that we actually have data for the whole world, essentially, and we can also say that there's a staggering variation overall. So going back to this, you can see there are places in the world where when you ask this question on a scale of 0 to 10, the average answer is 3. And then there are places where the average answer is almost 8. Okay, so what are the two possibilities? Well, it could be that people adapt to their conditions. So if you become richer as a country, everyone's aspirations or expectations goes up and they don't report a higher life satisfaction. Or it could be that people are comparing their own fortunes to those around them. And that rather than having a higher level of consumption, what actually our brains are wired to give us psychological rewards for is to be doing better than what we see around us or than our expectations. Okay, so in both of these stories, basically our expectations change with time just as economies grow, and that takes away the psychological benefit. Now, there's a lot of work to do on this. I'm only throwing it out as an introduction. I'm not going to pursue it with you. Well, I'll come back to it a little bit more. Okay, so we now have data for a lot of countries. If you've heard that the rewards to economic growth or to wealth peter out at high levels of wealth and that people stop getting happier, make sure you've actually seen the primary data and make sure you've seen them plotted the right way. Okay? If your concept of the right question to ask is what's the relationship between subjective well-being or life satisfaction and income per capita, and I'll argue that's a too simplistic question, but if that's your first question, then you'll actually find that the log here of income is very nicely correlated with life satisfaction. So each dot here is a country, and on the vertical axis is the average level of life satisfaction. On the horizontal is a logarithmic scale of income, so income goes up. you can see, if anything, if you look at the richer countries, it gets steeper. Okay, so now, I'm sort of just throwing that out there. Now, what if you ask a slightly more complex question? So if you just, back to starting from a simpler one, if you just say, how much of the variation across countries can you, the variation in life satisfaction across countries, can you explain just by looking at income per capita? And the answer is quite a lot, over 75%. If you ask instead, well, there are a lot of other aspects of life which might be correlated with wealth of nations. What if we ask about a slightly more complex set of factors that might be relevant to life satisfaction? And you find that, in fact, if you put in a few more social factors, such as, do you have friends or family to count on in difficult times? A measure of healthy life expectancies. Do you feel like you have a freedom to choose choose your own path in life? A question about perceived corruption. And we would have, in other contexts, I would add some other important social variables on here, but unfortunately these are the only ones that we have for this large set of countries. All of a sudden we can explain much more by these other factors, which you might call social and institutional, than by the income. Indeed, things get a little bit more surprising if you look in another context. Here is the relationship between income per capita in provinces in Canada and life satisfaction in provinces. And instead of a curve that slopes upwards, in other words, the richer provinces are happier, you find the opposite. If we play the same kind of games I just showed you for the whole world, to try and explain, say, the difference between the Atlantic provinces, which are at the upper left of this plot, and, say, British Columbia, which is the least satisfied with life, we find the following. We can actually explain all the difference pretty well in terms of the degree to which people feel like they belong to their neighborhood and their province and their country. The degree to which people are visiting their friends and family. Okay, I mean the frequency with which people see or have contact with friends and family. In fact, a lot of people out west have family back east, and so they're quite far from them. The degree to which people trust their neighbors and other constituents of society, and some other demographic variables. In fact, income here, in this particular context, is negative. Okay, so as you already saw from the overall relationship. So we find within a country like Canada, in fact, that social factors seem to be more important than the first thing an economist would look for. And these other things, I mean, these are difficult to measure. I'm telling you, essentially, a number of these are very subjective as well. If I ask you how often do you have contact with friends, you can probably give me a quantitative answer. It's probably somewhat objective, but your sense of belonging is something which we can make up psychological metrics for, but it's not something economists are used to dealing with at all. So to find out that these things are explaining a lot of the answer to this question that seems like a valuable proxy for welfare is a challenge. Okay. So one big thing that's come out of the economics of well-being literature is the following. Imagine that you live in this house. In fact, this house, although it looks fairly normal, has been retrofitted to be LEED Platinum. It's kind of an eco home now. I don't even remember where this is. But there's nothing remarkable about it. It's modest. Doesn't look fancy. It's in a middle-class neighborhood. And its residents are perfectly content there. Until they read the news about what Justin Bieber did for his birthday, his 18th birthday, which was to buy himself a birthday present for $12 million. And he has, I don't remember the specs of this, it's got 6 massive bedrooms and 3 swimming pools and etc., etc., etc. And all of a sudden, what seemed to be a perfectly comfortable existence doesn't feel so good anymore. Okay, so I've referred to this before. This is one of the possibilities for what could be going on in the international, with this Easterland paradox, in which people don't seem to necessarily be getting happier when they get wealthier. In fact, there's really good, if you think about what would be a evolutionary model, if you're at all motivated or convinced by that kind of thing, of how we would evolve assessments and feelings, you might well be convinced, as a few theorists have, that in fact the right way to design our psychology would indeed be to be sensitive to differences, to relative measures of even material consumption. So this is meant to have graphics integrated there. Another big theme that I think we can say we've got from this literature, which has brought us a lot of interaction with psychologists, is that I now see the world quite differently from looking at these data for a few years now. And I interpret everything I see in terms of the social nature of humans. I think what makes us special, and we're not unique this way, but we certainly are an extreme, is that we are incredibly social beings. And to think that we could have sort of a welfare measure, a well-being measure, which just relates to the thing that's happening just to us, our own individual level of consumption, say, is not just a poor approximation, it's completely off the mark. And so I now see that both for behavior and for well-being, it's things like group identity and our sense of belonging that are really important, both to explain what we do and also how we feel. And that measures of trust, which we now have a fair bit of and around the world, are hugely important for explaining well-being. Measures of engagement. I mentioned the degree to which we are in contact with friends and family, but think about if you're interested in the well-being that we get from work, say, okay, we can quantify the beneficial aspects of a workplace, of a career, in terms of income, since income is one of the things that matters. If we play that game, we find that, for instance, the degree to which you trust your coworkers is more important in the sense that if you change that by one standard deviation, the equivalent change in income that you'd need to produce to produce an equivalent boost in satisfaction is on the order of your entire income. In other words, it almost doesn't make sense. It simply tells you that if you think about benefits in terms of the narrow material measures that we have easily at hand in economics, you find that things like the quality of our social interactions blow them away. So that screams out to us that we need to be measuring these things more carefully in order that we can A, be more aware and promote them in our policy, and secondly, understand those trade-offs better. In fact, as an economist, it doesn't make sense. The relationship I just said doesn't make sense because you would think that managers would then be able to reduce wages, improve workplace interactions, and make more profit, right? So there's, well, that's still a dilemma. Why is that not happening? Okay, and in fact, there's even literature on the individual benefits you get from pro-social behavior, from giving things away. In fact, probably the best thing you can do for your happiness is to be doing something with others, for others, and to feel like you have a productive role in that endeavor. Let me. This is sort of a summary paper because it describes several studies. But these are some colleagues who looked at the value of pro-social giving. And so they did, these are psychologists, they did a study where, I'll describe a few studies quickly. So one of them, they showed that the mere thought of having some money, in other words, if you just switch if you frame the situation in terms of even mentioning concept of money or endowing somebody with some money, that makes people less likely to help their own acquaintances, to donate to charity, or to choose to spend time with others, even though these are precisely the kinds of behaviors that are strongly associated with happiness. Okay? So this is, I would definitely, as to the degree to which disciplines matter, this is in the realm of psychological studies rather than economics, because it tends to be an awful lot harder to do an economic experiment on these same kind of things. But these studies are pretty convincing. In a survey of Americans, pro-social spending here, which was donations, spending on others, was unrelated to happiness. Personal spending, but pro-social spending was associated with significantly greater happiness. And in the study of employees who were given a unexpected degree of bonus at the end of their year at work, only the extent to which people spent that on others did it affect their life satisfaction. On the other hand, if you give people a small amount of money and you tell them, go and spend it on whatever you like, or even go and spend it on what will make you happy, they go out and buy themselves a treat. If you tell them, go and spend it on somebody else, okay, you reduce their choices, their choice set, tell them to go and spend it on something else, they end up happier. Not only that, but if you then sit down and describe the experiment to them and say, what do you think people will do and which will make them happier? People believe that the average subject will go and spend it on themselves and will end up being happier. Okay. This slide is maybe a little abstract, but it brings some ideas together about sort of what are the classes of mistakes we can be making. And I'm not going to go into detail, but in economics it's pretty important to distinguish between the mistakes that individuals are making, which we mostly ignore in economics, except for recently in behavioral economics in a certain way, and the mistakes that come about because it's not just one person. Okay? So let me focus on those first. I've told you one already, that if my benefit comes from not my absolute level, say, of material consumption, but my relative level of material consumption, that means every time I improve my own income, I'm making somebody else less happy. If in a world in which people are motivated that way, on average, the society will be less happy than in a world in which you somehow restrict that behavior. Or you compensate for it, say by putting an extra tax on labor income, which has other effects. But this isn't a collective action problem, it's an externality. So that's sort of on the consumption side. We also have externalities that come about because of, we also have problems that come about because of externalities which are not to do with our psychology relating to others, but because what we do has material consequences for others. Okay? And so here you can think of many things, including all the environmental problems and the biggest of them all, climate change. On the other hand, we could be making mistakes as individuals, and this is a really, maybe subtle, but actually a very important difference. If we become open as economists to the idea that individuals actually could be making the wrong decisions for their own well-being. On the consumption side, I would say, what if, as some of the experiments I just hinted at from my psychologist friends, what if we actually have systematically incorrect beliefs about what it is that's going to make us happier? What if there is something in our current equilibrium, in our current society, which perpetuates those beliefs? So that we're all, so that they're stably incorrect. Everyone has biased beliefs. If you go and talk to somebody else, they'll have the same beliefs. They'll confirm your own beliefs. So economists generally actually don't consider that possibility. And I would say that it may be, so the extreme form of this hypothesis, say I'm not going to propose it as necessarily being true, but imagine the extreme form of this hypothesis. It may be nowadays that we get more information about what makes humans happy from actors than we do from ourselves and real people. if that were true, and if there was some, as you can imagine, corporate motivation behind a lot of those actors, then absolutely we could be in big problem. And the question then is, well, how big? Is this a small effect, or is this actually something that dominates? Surely, right, if it's a small effect, fine. But we need to know the size of that. Okay, and the lower left quadrant there is maybe less exciting. So what are the solutions? Well, in the individual mistakes, it could be education. So we actually don't necessarily need to interfere and start mandating what people do. It may be that just education about, say, research on happiness may have a big effect, just like if you're familiar with the book Nudge and literature on that. There are a lot of ways you can change people's behaviors to deal with, well, for whatever purpose you like. On the other hand, the solution to collective action problems is always to impose rules and incentives to steer people's behavior toward so that everyone together is better off. Okay, so I want to pose a couple questions for you, and then if there's any more time, I'm going to end on what I referred to earlier, that to show you a little bit of data about Quebec, because we live in an unusual place, it turns out. But I want you to think about this a little bit. This first question, this is a question I want you to debate in pairs, so you can chat with your neighbor for about a minute or two. But this is actually a question which I probably, well, I'll tell you what I think in a moment, but this would divide a lot of people quite strongly. So imagine that we found out we could generate a drug which, rather than having all kinds of deleterious effects and addictive effects, it actually produced a satisfied with life feeling. Okay, so maybe not just euphoria, but really satisfaction. And it was cheap to produce, and so we could spend time taking that drug and worry a lot less about an awful lot of other things. And if we managed to do this in a way that we still produced the basics, and we found a way to just produce this drug a whole lot and make everyone satisfied with life, would that be good policy? Okay, so I'm pushing now to the very extreme what to do with this literature in terms of policy. Okay, so I want you to think about this a little bit because I want to know what you think. So, so discuss that with a neighbor for a moment. Let's bring it back, because I want to throw two other questions before we wrap up. That was also a bit of an experiment. For those of you who did not manage to engage with a neighbor because your chair was too far away or you were thinking about something else, I assure you, you are now less happy than your neighbors who were chatting with somebody else. Okay, the value of social interaction. Anybody have a strong feeling after chatting? Yes?
When I read this, I sort of thought of weed or MDMA, and of marijuana and MDMA, and their effects. And it's sort of it's like ecstasy, but without the speed. It's a drug that. Anyways, and I thought of it sort of like the problem that I had with the situation is I would have an issue if it was something run by industries. If it was something you can grow in your backyard and you have control over it, and you have control as an individual to not get lazy or not overuse it, as some people can, then you as an individual making your choice, that's cool. But if it's something that's done by an industry or controlled by the government too much, then I would have an issue.
Thank you. One other person?
I was thinking that a potential problem is it could become addictive, not in maybe a physical sense, like maybe not physically addictive, but if everyone were all medicated to be happy all the time, they would be less motivated to actually improve external circumstances, which means that without, or at least maintain those circumstances, which means they'd likely deteriorate. So without the drug, people would become less happy than they were to start with, which would sort of increase the need to take the drug.
Okay, good. So if I've spelled it correctly, some of you may get the soma illusion here. I mean, the scenario is supposed to be that our needs are taken care of. We've automated them, or we do a bit of work or something. I set this up a bit of a straw man. My answer is absolutely. Let's do it. Let's produce the drug and medicate everybody, because the key here is that we're asking about life satisfaction, not about happiness, not about euphoria. And it turns out that people don't want zero stress in their life for a satisfied life. They don't even want to be happy all the time. They actually want challenge, they want productive engagement. And so I don't think we're in danger of ever finding such a drug. In fact, they also want novelty. They want, right? So if you could find a drug that shut all those things down and produced true life satisfaction, then I think that's something that we should probably heavily invest in as a society. Now, on the other hand, should we be teaching people in school how to be happy? I'm going to leave this. I suspect that this is the choir that's being preached to in this regard. But I would say that this is my own answer is this is a major lack, right? So for some reason, I think we are afraid to teach social skills, to teach people how to promote life satisfaction long term, possibly even. I mean, if meditative behavior is good for life satisfaction, why would we not teach that? Why would we focus entirely on what cynics would call job skills as soon as we get people into the formal education system? But there are certainly detractors, and you can imagine the risks. And the risk is paternalism, right? So if you have a theory for what makes people happy, it had better be on very good grounds. It had better be empirically accountable, so that if you're wrong, it can be debated, and so on. Here's one more, and I'm pushing. All these I'm pushing sort of, if you like, easy because they're extreme cases of policy. What if we found out? I told you that people compare to others. Okay, well, you can only compare to others if you see or know about them. Everyone in the world almost nowadays, amazingly, watches Hollywood, or else South American or Bollywood versions of it. But what if we found that knowing how rich and comfortable people are in some rich society is actually bad for life satisfaction for those in a poorer place? So you could think wherever that is. Should we then restrict the flow of information? Is that a good reason for India to shut down importing Hollywood or anywhere else to do the same? That one I'm going to throw at you. So talk about this again for a minute, and I want to see what you say. Anybody have the answer? The correct answer? Nobody knows the answer. Yes.
I would say no, just because. I was talking to her about how I read something about concentration camps in North Korea. Like, some people were born there, and they were just told that the outside world was even worse than whatever they were living now. So I kind of, in a sense, that's kind of one extreme end of the situation. But obviously, if you remove kind of a comparison, with other people, you also enter a state of maybe you're censoring too much and you're brainwashing them into thinking that they're happy when they're not.
Okay, it's obviously a slippery slope if you start restricting information. So my answer to this is I'm not interested. I mean, it's completely it's a non-starter. There's so much from the subjective well-being literature that tells us win-win policies and feasible policies that we don't need to worry about silly things like this, even though the way I described it is probably true. So I'd love to hear, more thoughts on any of those questions in discussion from you after. I just want to show you, actually I'm going to start here by showing you a quick video. I'm about 2 minutes away from being done here. This one looks like a video desktop movie player. Okay, so this is an animation of a graph that you've already seen here. Oh, it's in French. The horizontal axis here is annual income. These are provinces in Canada. The vertical axis is average life satisfaction. The size here is just related to population. The colors are related to a measure of trust in neighbors, but we don't have that every year. This is an animation over time. It's going to start in 1985 and go up to 2008. And so the punchline here is to do with Quebec. So the problem with this first starting screen is that where's Quebec? So the year is written on the top. Okay, so there's one blip. That's actually one year. Apart from that 1 year, there's actually been a steady rise in Quebec of well-being over the period from 1905 to 2008. And compared in particular to the other big provinces, Ontario, BC, Alberta, by 2002, it's surpassing them, and it's up there with the happy small provinces, which is smaller here tends to correlate with lower income per capita, and it's now near the top. The story since in 2009, 10, 11 is not quite monotonic, but the picture is similar to that last one. And so, as I mentioned, Canada is actually, we're lucky here to have a fairly high life satisfaction. If you bought any of what I say, then we're lucky. But Quebec has had some remarkable problem back in 1985, possibly some echo of the Quiet Revolution, has undergone very curious transformation. And so I've done work to try and figure out what that is, and instead I've managed to eliminate a lot of easy theories. Okay? And so as I mentioned, if you were now to rank Quebec against other countries, we would be number 2. After Denmark. But often these rankings overlap, so in confidence intervals. Okay, so well, here's the same thing. Here's Quebec versus the rest of Canada. Through different political regimes, through all kinds of major events that happen to do with the distinct culture and self-determination. And so I'm going to end on that. And I would love to, I have time if anyone wants to stick around and ask a few questions. Thank you.
Conference. Can we have another round of applause for
And are there any questions anyone would like to ask?
actually,
do you mind taking a picture?
Oh, no? Do you want us to come up? I can. I don't know if there's time. Okay. Maybe after. Oh, hello.
I'm sorry.
Wait, you want?
Oh, do you know how to take it?
Yeah, well.
Oh, sorry. No, yeah.
Thank you so much.
expect to see rooming time. Expect to see it in your absolutely. Yeah.
So when did you do this?
I did it over the
Does anybody have a question?
I actually did. I feel like a few people here have questions. I feel like a bunch of people do.